Willkommen, ik ben Rabbit, and today we're going to be looking at a common myth about World War II called just build StuGs. This is wherein a lot of people will posit that one of the routes that Germany could have taken to victory is just building more of the Sturmgeschütz assault guns. Now, this is mostly based on the fact that the Sturmgeschütz were very successful against other armored fighting vehicles, which in and of itself is probably a flaw that most people can identify as not really being the best rationale. But there are also a lot of other problems with the idea of building StuGs to the exclusion of all other AFVs. Now, I would also like to apologize in advance. Despite living in Germany for 2 years and working with the Bundeswehr and the Bundestag, my German is actually quite awful. Meine Deutsch ist nicht gut. Bitte. So if the actual German speakers could please bear with me on my terrible German, that would also be appreciated. The first thing to note about the StuG is, well, what is a StuG? The StuG is the SturmGeschütz III. This was specifically a self-propelled assault gun based on the Panzer III chassis. Now, the SturmGeschütz III used the same 7.5cm field gun that German infantry units were using at the time as essentially direct fire support for enemy fortifications or for assaulting enemy positions. So the idea of putting this on a fully protected and tracked chassis to allow it to be both more mobile and more protected while providing that firepower isn't exactly revolutionary. As the war went on, the original 7.5cm low velocity gun of the StuG was replaced by the 10.5cm howitzer, and then finally the 7.5cm Kampfwagenkanon, which is the KWK-40, more commonly seen on the German Panzer IV. This was a higher velocity gun, better at engaging tanks, but had a slightly worse high explosive shell, but could still provide effective direct fire support. It's important to note, however, that the field gun crews weren't actually panzer crews, they were artillery crews, and thus the Sturmgeschütz crews were also artillery crews. Which is also why the title Sturmgeschütz doesn't really appear beyond the StuG III. This is one of those little details of everybody wants to be the father of success, but a failure is an orphan. Well, the Sturmgeschütz, it turns out, were successful, and the much more prominent Panzer arm wanted control of them. So that's why once you get past the Sturmgeschütz III, like Jagdpanzer IV is now a Jagdpanzer, which is specifically a tank hunter, and falls under the Panzer arm. This is pretty noteworthy, even though it seems like a minor distinction, because it turns out the artillery crews and the panzer crews had different training and different mentality in terms of how they approached combat scenarios. Additionally, an assault gun was attached to an infantry unit and was used alongside infantry units. Even infantry units like Fallschirmjägers, which were paratroopers that traditionally don't have a lot of armor, would still use things like Sturmgeschütz pretty regularly. Conversely, something like a Panzerjäger or even a tank, a Panzer, would have not necessarily had the same reliable access to infantry support. So this in and of itself creates a bit of a situation where you have a level of guaranteed infantry support with a Sturmgeschütz that you wouldn't necessarily have with other combat arms. And you also, to an extent, have a level of coordination, although not really. A lot of infantry officers didn't understand how to use tanks and Sturmgeschütz in general. The Panzer Grenadiers generally had training to use them. However, the Panzer Grenadiers started running very thin later in the war, and a lot of Panzer units were simply accompanied by normal infantry that didn't have the same level of training. But this also creates another issue because the artillery crews were trained to approach combat in a more methodical way. They didn't think of themselves as the exploitation force to punch a hole in the enemy lines and go into the enemy's backline. They thought of themselves more as a supporting element. This is also very obvious when you see that not only did the Jagdpanzers not generally enjoy the same success as the StuGs in terms of how successful they were against enemy armor, but also when you look at the Ferdinands, the original batch of Ferdinands in the Operation Kursk, when used side by side, some of them were issued to artillery crews, some of them were issued to panzer crews. The panzer crews thought the Ferdinand was absolutely awful, like it couldn't do any of the jobs they wanted it to do. But that's because they were pushing it to try and be this exploitation and breakthrough vehicle, whereas the artillery crews that were using the Ferdinands as a long-range supporting fire element found it to be much more successful. The powerful gun combined with the good frontal armor, it was fantastic at supporting infantry. Perhaps a bit temperamental, but the gun was effective, the armor was effective, and it was very accurate out to long range. And this, in and of itself, shows the big difference that you're going to see between an artillery crew and a panzer crew getting the same piece of equipment. We also have the anecdote in that American tank crews weren't necessarily trained to engage enemy tanks in the same way that American tank hunter crews in World War II were. However, several American tank units actually got their tank destroyers to give their tankers classes on how to engage enemy armor and found their tankers were much more successful afterwards. So even fairly simple things like the training and mentality of the crews can have a very big effect on how effective it is, So just because you issue out a bunch of Sturmgeschütz doesn't necessarily mean you would get the same results. You would probably see significantly diminishing returns if you issued them the same way you'd issue something like a Panzer IV or a Panther or a Tiger, etc. While part of the assumption about the Sturmgeschütz being issued out to all the crews and being more effective is based on raw effectiveness, another part is that it is assumed that it would be significantly cheaper to build a Sturmgeschütz III than something like, say, a Panther or a Tiger. And this may not necessarily be the case. Now, Military History Visualized has a great video on this that I will link to in the description, going over how it's actually difficult to rate exactly how much individual pieces of equipment in the Wehrmacht cost. But the Wehrmacht did estimate that it was more expensive to produce a Panzer IV than a Panther. And at first glance, this seems kind of ridiculous. The Panzer IV is a lot smaller and a lot more compact than a Panther. However, if we were to look at, say, the M4 Sherman, at the very beginning of the war, if you look at the geometry on the front of the hull, you have all these bulges, all these other things that would need additional welding man-hours and additional machining operations. By the time you get to the end of the war, the entire M4A3 front plate is essentially a single flat piece of steel that's welded to the rest of the tank. This is to both simplify production, reduce weak points, and also it just saves you a bunch of man hours in the production and assembly process. So if we take that and we walk it over to the Panzer IV versus Panther comparison, the Panzer IV has a lot of geometry on both the turret and the hull. All of these are individual pieces, all of them have to be machined individually, all of them have to be welded individually. Whereas the Panther, the entire front of the tank is basically just a giant piece of metal, and they are, if you can probably tell if you've seen them up close, they actually have this kind of Lego brick thing where they lock into each other and then you weld them around those locks. So it's actually a much simpler production, even though it is a larger and generally more capable vehicle. What this means is, while it kind of sort of seems like on paper the StuG should be cheaper because the Sturmgeschütz is a lot smaller, that's not necessarily the case. The reason the Sturmgeschütz offered a cost savings was because the Panzer III was already in production at the time, and as the war was going on, the Panzer III was increasingly an obsolete platform that wasn't really well suited to frontline combat. Even as early as Barbarossa, the limitations on the 3.7 and 5 centimeter guns that were equipped with were starting to become pretty obvious. So repurposing those into tank destroyers with a casemate and a more powerful gun to directly support your infantry was a viable and inexpensive way to use the chassis you already had. However, once those chassis start to run dry, do you just keep building more of these inefficient platforms just to build Sturmgeschütz, or do you build an entirely different purpose-built platform for it? And if you're building another purpose-built platform for it, what's to say you're not going to run into the same problem that you ran into with things like Panther and Tiger, etc., etc., etc. So the net savings in terms of vehicles is probably a lot smaller than most people think it is. And to carry that forward to another point, it turns out just having more vehicles doesn't necessarily equate to more combat power on the battlefield. A standard Sturmgeschütz platoon would consist of anywhere between 2 to 4 vehicles, depending on at what point in the war you have them, and then you would also have assorted ammunition, support, command elements, etc., etc., etc. So if you wanted to put together a full company, you would need anywhere between 6 to 12 Sturmgeschütz to actually put together that unit, on top of a bunch of additional personnel and service and support elements, and that is actually pretty expensive. You're talking a bunch of additional resources to stand up these units. And given how few Sturmgeschütz would likely be added with the switch in production, you're more likely looking at a bunch of replacement vehicles or replacement parts for existing vehicles rather than full-on new units, and simply having your units being closer to full strength wouldn't necessarily have a direct impact on the battlefield in an observable fashion that would actually result in any meaningful differences in terms of how any of the major battles of the war played out. Now, to launch into a final point on the problem with just building StuGs, if you were to imagine that a single Tiger could be expected to destroy 5 enemy tanks before going down, or 2 Panthers could be expected to destroy 4 enemy tanks each before going down, or 3 StuGs could be expected to destroy 3 enemy tanks each before going down, and all of these is essentially a production unit, which one of these do you produce? This seems like an interesting dilemma, and it also seems like the easy choice is the Sturmgeschütz. But I haven't actually told you how many Allied tanks are being produced for every German tank is being produced, and that's the real trick of the question. If for each of these quote-unquote units, every American factory were producing 6 tank units, every Russian factory were also producing 6 tank units, and every British factory were producing 2 units, now it doesn't really matter what you pick. You're trying to take out 14 enemy tanks, and the most you could ever take out is 9. This highlights the problem. Over the course of World War II, Germany had an estimated 46,000 tanks produced, which seems like a lot, but the United States built around 99,000, the Soviet Union built around 100,000, and the British built around 29,000. The German industry was so far behind the gun on tank production that they could have built whatever they want. You're rearranging the metaphorical deck chairs on the Titanic. The ship is sinking anyway, it's just a question of how stylish do you want your defeat to be. And to be fair, in that regard, the Germans did actually make their defeat pretty stylish with tanks like the King Tiger, the Jag Tiger, and eventually the Mouse. It is at least a stylish way to go down, and if you are going to go down, you might as well do it in style. As a fully armored direct fire infantry support platform, the Sturmgeschütz was undeniably successful, and it also happened to be rather effective at engaging hostile armor as well. However, a lot of internet armchair historians and even some of the German generals at the time seem to have kind of lost the plot on exactly what made the Sturmgeschütz good and what made it successful to begin with, and tried to heap on features and put it in roles that it was never really intended to and would never really excel in. And as a bit of a modern epilogue to the Sturmgeschütz, the idea of a fully armored direct fire infantry support weapon to support lighter units that aren't necessarily fully armored hasn't exactly been lost on the modern battlefield. The United States Army recently adopted the M10 Booker, basically for that exact same role for lighter units that can't necessarily accommodate things like the M1 Abrams. Additionally, we're also seeing in Ukraine older model vehicles like T-62s and T-55s being used in a very similar role, demonstrating that while a casemate vehicle isn't exactly in vogue anymore, the original role that the StuGs were designed and used for is still very much in demand on the modern battlefield. And that concludes our video today. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun, hope you learned something. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, that always helps out the channel. Until next time, danke bitte, tschüss!